Russian aviation is something that Russian propagandists love to boast about. It occupies an important niche in the myth called the Second Army of the World.
The advanced multi-role fighters Su-57 and Su-57 are in the final stage of state trials. These machines have incredibly unique characteristics and are truly the best in the world.
The best, the fastest, the most powerful, and many more like that. The very best is poured into the ears by the Russian authorities. To confirm this, Putin himself tries to sell his planes to the world at a higher price. In 2019, for example, he took leaders of other countries to show off the then brand new Su-57. However, in Russia, they very tactfully remain silent about the fact that Russian aviation is indeed actually in decline, and most of Russia's planes are still from the Soviet era with not much time left. This is confirmed by numerous unforeseen, unexpected, and unanticipated incidents involving the crash of Russian pride. Another one. Russia has always tried to compete with the USA in the arms race. And of course, they constantly shout that the Kremlin is winning in this competition. But there's a catch. The United States has long since stopped competing with Russia. After all, the level of Russian aviation is now what the USA had about 20 years ago.
Diligence is actually a separate talent. It's not just, a rubber butt.
But if the Russians want to compete, it's the perfect time to compare the aviation power of the States and Russia. What can Washington boast about? And does Moscow have anything to respond with? Let's figure it out. To not immediately shatter the wet dreams of the Russians, we'll start with their aviation. For example, the relatively new Su-34s. It was put into service a little over 10 years ago, although its first flight was back in 1990. But today we won't pay attention to such trifles. So, the almost new Su-34. The Su-34 is a modification of the more well-known Su-27. For the first time, Russia used the Su-34 back in 2008 during the invasion of Georgia. They were also deployed in Syria. The fighter had not yet been officially commissioned, but Russian propaganda tried to create the image of an extremely powerful aircraft. However, even in Syria, the fighters failed. It turned out that they were, to put it simply, not very accurate. Therefore, the Russian authorities rebranded and rearmed the aircraft. The new Su aircraft was loaded with cluster munitions instead of precision-guided ones. Nothing changed during the invasion of Ukraine. The Su-34 usually drops bombs, but even then, they occasionally mess up. For example, when they accidentally decided to bomb Belgorod, to understand how old this aircraft is on a global scale, the Su-34 is equivalent to the not the F-16, but the F-15E strike, which was commissioned in the late 80s. There is another modernization of the Su-27, which is the Su-35. Considered a 4+ generation aircraft, the first flight of the serial aircraft was in 1992. However, once again, it did not quickly enter service. In the early 90s, the project was halted and only resumed in 2005. Well, once again, we consider this a new aircraft. Its cost is about $100 million. Tens of years of development have not passed. In vain, the Su-35 is better than the Su-27. Let's not hide it. For example, the avionics of the new Sukhoi are better. But when it comes to the old, by American standards, F-16, the Su-35 catastrophically loses. Yes, in fact, all Russian aircraft lose to the F-16, except probably the Su-57. But we will discuss it later. By the way, the F-16 is already over 40 years old, but it hasn't lost its position in the world. All Russian aircraft can only envy its arsenal. Additionally, it is relatively inexpensive, costing from $10 to $50 million depending on the modification and year of production. The Su-35, oh, I remind you, costs $100 million. The MiGs, I think it's not even worth talking about. Let's move straight to the newest Russian aircraft, the Su-57 fighter jet, which the Russians are indeed absolutely drooling over. According to Moscow statements, this is supposedly a fifth-generation fighter. Its creation began, as is usually the case in the Russian Federation, with an arms race. Russian developers wanted to compete with the renowned and legendary F-22 Raptor, which, in general terms, is already outdated by U.S. standards. But back then, it was an obsession for them. Therefore, the highly skilled Russians quickly made a model, and in 2004 came to Putin with assurances that in just a few years, this bird would be soaring majestically high up into the vast open sky. However, the first tests began only in 2010, and then on the Su-35 engine, which is simply not capable of supersonic flight in cruising mode, which is a requirement for fighters. Fifth generation. Talking about the characteristics of this aircraft is pointless. Everything is just on paper. No one has really seen its actual performance. By the way, we mentioned that the Su-57 was supposed to compete with the Raptor. However, a few years later, the Russians did another flip in the air as the F-22 had already been taken out of production. This happened in 2011, so at that time, Russia claimed that the Su-57 was actually a response not to the Raptor, but to another fifth-generation fighter, the F-35. So let's indeed analyze the F-35, which the US is extremely proud of, and it's also called the most desirable tactical aircraft in the world.
Currently, all branches of the military, including the Air Force, the Army, which are the ground forces, the Marine Corps, and the Navy, will have a unified type of aircraft, such as the F-35, for example.
The F-35 embodies the functions of 3 aircraft on a single platform. The maximum speed of the fighter is 1906 km/h, and the combat radius is about 1,000 km. It has the latest advanced avionics, a multifunctional radar system that effectively operates against both air and ground targets. And also the helmet.
That is, there is also a helmet-mounted targeting system. What does this mean? The aircraft flies forward? The missile? By turning the pilot's head left or right, it targets all 90 degrees. Or even programmatically, it first launches forward, then turns and flies towards the target that is pursuing the F-35 aircraft.
And the helmet also highlights targets in the air and on the ground, such as friendly units and other elements in the environment and so on. Moreover, it monitors the pilot's health and overall well-being. The F-35 is not just a dream and aspiration for any country. They have completely shattered Putin's dreams and aspirations for air superiority and dominance. Their Su-57 doesn't even come close. The F-35 wouldn't even look at it. However, for the Americans, even this aircraft has become outdated. You heard right. By U.S. standards, the F-35 is the past. However, the future foundation of U.S. aviation is considered to be the B-21 Raider. 21 Raider. It is expected to single-handedly ensure the dominance of the American armed forces in the air. However, there's nothing to say about it yet, as everything is kept secret.
But that's not surprising considering for what, or more precisely against whom, the B-21 was developed. The aircraft is not for Europe. To fight in Europe or to fight in Africa, the countries are all small. It is specifically and precisely designed for large countries such as China and Russia. It can fly in, travel long distances, and effectively conduct bombings with both conventional and nuclear weapons.
With your permission, we will not draw any conclusions. Instead, you write how you perhaps understand and perceive the American and Russian aviation power? Who, in your opinion, do you think dominates the skies? Also, don't forget to like this video and be sure to subscribe to our new Arsenal channel so you don't miss all the most interesting content.